you've ever spent time out in an open field or a large asphalt parking lot on a clear July afternoon, you know what it feels like to stand face to face with the sheer power of the sun. You can feel the heat radiating off the ground and start looking for any scrap of shade. While you do so, you might notice the air shimmering above the horizon. If you're like me, someone who spent a career studying the atmosphere and tracking the movement of energy through the Earth's systems, you may find yourself looking up at that midday sun and asking a fundamental question. How can we harness that immense raw power to run a modern society? Today we're going to travel to Western India, to the edge of a vast salt desert, and explore what happens when a nation decides to build its future around sunlight. We're going to look at the staggering scale of some of the largest energy projects ever constructed, the technical bottlenecks that threaten to slow them down, and the political, economic, and environmental challenges that emerge when a country tries to industrialize using renewable energy at an unprecedented scale. Welcome back to the podcast. I'm Dr. Mack, and this is the Climate Translation. To truly grasp the scale of what's happening in India right now, we need to start by grounding ourselves in a specific place. Let's travel to the Kutch region of Western India. It's right along the border with Pakistan. If you stood there today and looked across the landscape, you might wonder why anyone would build anything there at all. The terrain is flat, dry, and unforgiving. There are vast stretches of salt desert that extend to the horizon. Temperatures routinely climb above 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Water is scarce, vegetation is limited. To most people, it's a wasteland. But to an energy planner, it looks like cheap, available sunlight and a lot of it. This region receives some of the most intense and consistent solar radiation on the planet. Day after day and year after year, enormous amounts of energy arrive from the sun and strike a landscape that has very little competing use. That's why India chose this location for the Khavda Renewable Energy Park, and the project is truly massive. It covers 280 square miles. That's roughly the size of the 5 boroughs of New York City combined. And when fully completed, it's expected to contain more than 60 million solar panels and generate as much as 30 gigawatts of electricity. That's enough output to easily supply 4.5 cities the size of Los Angeles, or about 22.5 million average U.S. homes at the same time. As a meteorologist, when I look at a project like this, I don't just see rows of silicon and glass. I see a fundamental shift in how energy is moving through society. Historically, when nations industrialized, they built their economic foundations on coal, oil, and natural gas, and the pattern was generally the same. You burn fossil fuels first, you build your wealth, and then you deal with the environmental consequences later. India, however, is attempting something different. Rather than waiting until after industrialization to build renewable energy systems, it's trying to build both at the same time. But projects of this scale don't happen in isolation. They reshape economies, they influence politics, and they attract enormous corporate investment. And they raise difficult questions about who controls the infrastructure of the future. The Khavda project is developed by the Adani Group, one of India's largest industrial conglomerates, and the project sits near a highly sensitive international border. It requires government exceptions to long-standing restrictions on development in the region, and like many projects involving vast amounts of money and strategic importance, it has become entangled in political controversy and international scrutiny. In other words, it's not a story simply about solar panels. It's about land, power, economics, and national priorities. And that brings us to a lesson of today's episode. The energy transition isn't about replacing one power source with another. It's truly about rebuilding the entire system. Because generating the electricity is only the first challenge. The harder questions come after the electricity is produced. Now, it's important to point out that while the sheer growth of solar capacity is staggering, the reality of turning sunlight into a reliable industrial power grid is never cut and dry. You can install millions of solar panels in a desert, but if you can't get that electricity to the factories in Mumbai or to the homes in New Delhi, hundreds of miles away, much of that energy never reaches the people who need it. And this is where India's solar ambitions are running headfirst into a massive infrastructure bottleneck. The physics of the problem are relatively simple. It takes roughly 18 to 24 months to clear the land and build a massive solar installation. Then you've got to build high voltage transmission lines that are needed to move that electricity across the country. That can take 5 years or more. That mismatch creates a serious challenge. In some regions, solar generation has expanded faster than the grid can absorb it. During peak production periods, operators are sometimes forced to curtail or shut off solar generation because the transmission network cannot carry all the available power. To address this, India is investing heavily in what it calls green energy corridors, a massive effort to expand and modernize the nation's transmission infrastructure so renewable electricity can move from remote production sites to the major population and industrial centers. But transmission is only the first challenge. There's a second problem that every solar power economy eventually encounters. The sun goes down. Heavy industry doesn't. Factories, data centers, and hospitals operate around the clock. Solar panels do not. So what happens after sunset? Most people immediately think about lithium-ion batteries, and those batteries certainly play an important role. But storing enough electricity to power a smartphone, a home, or even an electric vehicle is very different from storing enough electricity to power a nation of 1.4 billion people. At that scale, the challenge becomes much larger. So how do you solve a storage problem that big? You can use gravity. India is increasingly investing in an engineering concept called pumped hydro storage. This may sound like some futuristic technology, but it's actually been around for decades. In fact, pumped hydro currently accounts for the vast majority of large-scale energy storage operating around the world today. I often explain it to my students by thinking of water as a giant mechanical battery. During the middle of the day, when solar parks are producing more electricity than the grid can handle, then the surplus power is used to run enormous pumps. Those pumps move water from low-lying reservoirs uphill into upper reservoirs. In effect, the electricity is being stored as gravitational potential energy. After sunset, when demand remains high but the solar production has dropped to zero, engineers simply reverse the process. The water is released. Gravity takes over. The water rushes downhill through hydroelectric turbines, generating electricity that can then be fed back into the grid almost instantly. The battery charges during the day and discharges at night. The Central Electricity Authority has already identified about 120 potential sites across the country for these giant water batteries. But even if you solve the problems of transmission and storage, another challenge remains: the supply chain. India wants to build a more self-reliant renewable energy sector, yet many of the raw materials they need, the components and the battery cells that support this expansion, depend heavily on international manufacturing networks. In many ways, it's a double stress on the system. The country's trying to build an infrastructure of tomorrow while still relying on many of the supply chains of today. So, in their quest for energy independence, they have to consider the technologies that make it possible still depend on materials, factories, and supply chains that lie beyond their border. And they have to consider issues that are more close to home. When we think about solar energy, we naturally think of it as clean, low impact, and environmentally friendly, especially when compared to coal-fired power plants. And in many ways, it is. But when you scale solar up to the level of an entire industrial economy, it begins interacting with the landscape in ways that aren't always obvious. To understand why, we need to think about two resources that are already under pressure in many parts of India: land and water. As I stated, India is home to more than 1.4 billion people, but it only occupies about 1/3 the land area of the US or China. Land is valuable, and large solar projects require a lot of it. If you were to put these anywhere where hundreds of square miles are devoted to energy production, questions would inevitably arise about what the land might otherwise be used for. This has created tension in many regions between energy developers and agricultural communities. After all, farming and solar power often compete for the same resource: open, sunny land. Researchers are increasingly exploring a compromise known as agrivoltaics. Instead of placing solar panels directly on the ground, the panels are elevated high enough for crops to grow beneath them. The arrangement can create benefits for both systems. The panels produce shade that reduces evaporation from the soil, while the vegetation below can help cool surrounding air and improve panel efficiency during hot weather. In other words, the same acre of land can sometimes produce both food and electricity. But land is only part of the story. There's another challenge hiding in the desert: dust. In the Kutch region, dust storms are common, and dust is surprisingly effective at reducing solar performance. A layer of dust on a solar panel acts like a thin blanket, blocking the sunlight before it can reach the cells beneath. Now, imagine trying to keep tens of millions of solar panels clean in the middle of an arid landscape. One solution may be water, but the problem is water is scarce. Using traditional washing methods at the scale of the Khavda project would place enormous demands on local water resources. So engineers have been forced to think differently. Instead of water trucks, many sections of the solar park are being maintained by autonomous cleaning robots. These machines move across the panels at night using brushes and air systems to remove dust without consuming precious water supplies. I think that's one of the most interesting lessons from this story. The climate transition isn't just about generating clean electricity. It's about solving a cascade of interconnected challenges. Every solution creates new engineering questions. How do you move the power? How do you store the power? How do you balance the needs of energy, agriculture, and water? As India is discovering, building a renewable energy future isn't simply a matter of installing solar panels. It's a matter of redesigning the entire system. So what does this entire case study actually tell us about the global climate transition and climate change in general? I think the answer is more complicated, but far more interesting than many of the headlines you read may suggest. For a long time, there's been an assumption that every nation would follow roughly the same path to industrialization. First came coal, then oil and natural gas, then decades later, cleaner technologies. That was the path followed by much of Europe, the US, and later China. But India is exploring something different. Instead of treating renewable energy as the final step in industrialization, it's attempting to make renewable energy part of the industrialization process itself. And that brings us to a concept economists call leapfrogging. Consider the example of telecommunications. In many developing nations, entire regions never built landline telephone networks. The technology arrived, but before the infrastructure could be fully expanded, mobile phones became available. So instead of spending decades installing millions of miles of copper wire, countries simply skipped that step and moved directly to cellular networks. They leapfrogged an entire stage of development. What we're seeing in India may represent something similar in the energy sector. Rather than building a massive new fossil fuel system and then replacing it decades later, the country is attempting to build large portions of its future energy infrastructure around solar generation, energy storage, and electrification from the beginning. That doesn't mean the transition is complete. Far from it. Coal still plays a major role in India's economy. Heavy industries like steel, cement, and manufacturing continue to depend heavily on fossil fuels because they require enormous amounts of reliable, high-temperature energy. The transmission bottlenecks we discussed earlier are real. The storage challenge is real. The supply chain dependencies are real. And the environmental trade-offs surrounding land and water use are real. But none of those challenges change the larger observation. The menu of options available to developing nations is changing. A generation ago, building an industrial economy powered primarily by solar energy would have sounded completely unrealistic. Today, countries are actively attempting it. And that might be the most important lesson from this story. Climate change is forcing us to rethink how energy moves through society. But it's also forcing us to rethink what development itself can look like. And that future may not follow the same blueprint as the past. Stories of climate transitions, like in India, aren't just about temperature records or emission charts. They're about how societies choose to capture, move, store, and use the energy to build their future. For most of the industrial era, we assumed that growth required fossil fuels. That was the blueprint followed by much of the modern world. But out in those salt deserts of Western India, we're watching a different experiment unfold. It's an attempt to answer a question that would have seemed almost impossible a generation ago. Can a rapidly developing nation build a significant portion of its future around renewable energy from the very beginning? The answer is still being written. There's going to be setbacks. There's going to be infrastructure bottlenecks. And there's going to be environmental trade-offs and difficult decisions along the way. But what makes this story so fascinating is that it reminds us of something we sometimes forget. The future isn't required to look exactly like the past. I'm Dr. Mack, and this has been The Climate Translation. If you have a question about the climate that you've been too afraid to ask, or if you have a differing opinion, I want to hear from you. I can use your viewpoints in future episodes. You can reach me at theclimatetranslation@gmail.com. I'll see you next time.